Okay, so we're going to get this kicked off. This is validating evidence for courtroom testimony, and you're going to see many speakers listed here. Myself, Jess, Mattia, Ian, Paul, Alexis, John, Mike, and Christoph. Lee Reber also contributed, and he was able to present with us down at Techno. So we have kind of a different group. We have already presented the first few steps, more of the handling and such, and now we're going to do the second half. And Jess is going to walk you through here in a moment the 6 steps overview. Here is the link to our paper. We will put it in the Slack for you as well. You can scan the QR code, which is very easy. Also, a quick thank you to all the vendors who backed us on this paper and said that they also support what we wrote. We put it in for DFIR review. So I'm hoping that this hits the DFIR review process. And this is something that I really believe in. Ian and I just had something go through DFIR review. Jess is behind it. And it's a fantastic way for you to have someone else in the community or a team of people in the community back your work. Jess, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Heather. And with that, just a note on DFIR review, 2 of the articles of the year nominated for Forecast Awards were DFIR reviewed. So if you happen to have looked at that initial paper, and I encourage you to download it if you haven't, there really were 6 steps overall that we came together as a community and said, these are the 6 things that are really critical in validating mobile evidence. And in those, there's 6 steps. The first one, determining all possible extraction methods for your search authority, which was a big dive of that presentation we did in that SANS webcast last month. The second one was processing the data in more than one tool. The third one, deep diving forensics. The fourth one, the focus of today's whole talk, which is what's incredible, is each one of these 6 steps can be dived into so deeply, validation. Then reporting and sharing your findings, and the 6th one being education. So we do encompass all of these in the paper, but for today, we're going to focus on validation. And with that, John will tell us a little bit about validation.
Thank you. My name is John Baer. I have a perspective of about 30 years of law enforcement and also e-discovery. So a lot of you probably in the audience are from the law enforcement background. But I just want to talk about this just a little bit when it comes to some of these validation type steps. You know, we have them listed here, and you can see the visual cross tool, call detail records, our closed circuit cameras, and those can apply to not only just closed circuit, but also just digital systems in general that capture video, carving and replication. And of course, in the e-discovery world, we don't have the luxury of the call detail records. And we're seeing a lot more. I want to talk about that just for a brief second here. The call detail records, we're seeing cases where a lot more people are using application data. So they'll use an application to facilitate in the communications between parties, whether it's text messaging, video chats, and whatnot. And these applications are not using network spectrum to terminate and fulfill the actual connection. So you're not going to get that information per se from a call detail record. So you have to actually look in the actual database itself on both ends of the parties to see that. Of course, with visual, it's probably kind of the most overlooked of the types of validation that we have. Visual is really easy to do. It doesn't require a lot of interfacing. Sometimes there can be devices that are damaged and you might not have the ability to see the visual properly with cracked screens and whatnot, and you may have to repair the phone. Of course, cross tool, depending on their toolbox, a number of different vendors have tools that support one another that can give you the results. You can use those and compare the results against each other. Carving, this can be dependent, especially in the e-discovery world, on the type of exam you get. So a lot of times in an e-discovery type case, we're not getting a full physical, or we're not getting something where we can actually carve manually into the data set. We're getting a logical container structure. We're getting something that's even prepared in a folder structure, and you don't have the ability to go in and actually see it in its raw state. And of course, replication, which I really love, is actually going out there and getting some test phones and going in and putting a baseline set of data set on there so you can see exactly where it is and what it's doing to the phone, and if you can replicate it. This of course you have to have the luxury of being able to get phones, buy them off eBay or buy them used. Sometimes that can be a price preventative obstruction depending on your agency. I know if a brand new phone came out, my captain would spend about an hour or two asking me why we're buying this phone. And then he'd go about asking me to ask the local agencies in that area to see if they had the phone so I could replicate it. But these are all the different types of validation that can be done. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Paul.
Thank you, John. So once you start getting to the data, understanding where the source is coming, where's that data coming from is super important once it comes to kind of moving through your investigation. Any type of data that you're getting at, you should be identifying the source and seeing and drilling down to figure out where that's coming from. If it's a critical piece to your case, whether it's an investigation or some civil litigation, drill down, look and find where this is coming from. Comes back to the validation piece. Document that, look at those databases, look at those files inside to make sure that that data matches up. Not only does that make you as an examiner or an investigator more comfortable with structure, it makes you more confident to speak to the data as well. And take notes of this, document where this is from. So when you do come back to have to deal with this later on, you actually have this documented properly when it comes to whether it's court in 2 or 3 years or something even more or longer. Keep in mind that getting down to the source is not always as easy as possible. Certain encrypted devices and tracing the data back down to the hex, it's not as easy as it is sometimes, but just be prepared to answer some of these questions of why certain decoded data turns out to be in a certain way. Again, it's don't be afraid to ask for help. Some things are outside of your scope of knowledge. Ask for help to try to do this. And again, if there's no source data, or if there's data is not sourced, question why is there no source data? Where is this coming from? How can I validate this? And this applies to every tool that there is that's out there. Again, a super important thing because if it's a critical piece of evidence that you're relying on, if you can't find that breadcrumb trail from where it came from, it could lead to a bit of a tough go afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Alexis, who's going to talk about the relevant files.
Thanks, Paul. This really goes or follows what Paul was talking about. When you know the path of where these source files are, now we're going to look into them. And I want to start from the bottom of the slide before we get into the actual type of files. This should be done after the extraction is obtained. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is you want to make an apples to apples comparison, right? You know what? You don't want to be looking at data in your validation process that's constantly changing, right? You want to make sure that that data, it's kind of frozen in a sense. Now, is there a role for validation of data that's constantly changing or live? Sure, there is. But when we're looking at how, and now we go into the next part, the actual type of files, how databases behave, how plist behaves, or other files in their native format, it's best, if possible, to have this frozen data set that you can then look at manually, visually, by hand, in comparison to the output of the tool or the process that you're validating. And some of the reasons for that are, well, you might have what I like to call incepted output, right? Which is data inside another piece of data. For example, a BP list inside a VP list. So we need to look into that, right? Because that BP list, like the shell, might contain validation data that will help you understand what's inside that other piece of data inside of that data, if that makes sense. Some data is interpreted, which Ian will be talking to us about it in a second, about timestamps, for example. So he'll speak to that. Data might be interpreted, so we need to validate that as well. If you, and like Paul was saying, if you're not really sure how a particular data type works, how it should be interpreted or looked into, the community is here to assist you. Other folks, experts in the area, will assist you. The folks here at the instructors are at SANS, also there to assist you. I'm here to assist you. And with that, let's look at the different types of data, specifically timestamps, with the one and only Ian Whiffen.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. So obviously timestamps are going to be hugely important in pretty much any investigation that you do. But you need to be confident that the timestamps are being decoded correctly and that the time zone offsets are being applied correctly if appropriate. Now, most timestamps will be stored on the device in UTC time, and then it's a relatively simple process to add or subtract the appropriate time zone hours. But in some cases, such as EXIF timestamps within photographs, they're going to be recorded in local time, which is the time that was shown on the device at the time the device was, the time the photograph was taken. And this is not going to change when you add and subtract a time zone offset. We also need to be sure that if the time zone that you're working with observes daylight savings time, that's going to be applied as well to the time zone that you're affecting the data with. But you also need to be aware of how daylight savings changes will affect the data when you jump forward or backwards an hour. This is going to affect the timeline of the artifacts on your device. And you could find yourself with two contradicting artifacts, or artifacts that appear contradicting. For example, two locations that are far apart, but at the same time. And it's purely because the time's gone back an hour at the time that the user moved. We also need to know where the timestamp comes from. Does it come from the time on the device? Does it come from the network time? Has the user set the time manually on the phone, or is it using network time? Or has the timestamp come from a third party, such as a server? There's been cases I've worked in the past where the sender and the recipient of an SMS message were both within the UTC -7 time zone, but the message was shown as a local time with a UTC -5 timestamp. And this is because the service center that was routing the message was based in the UTC -5 time zone. So again, I had to go in and manually work this out and work out how it all actually flowed on my report. We also need to be aware when the user moves between time zones. Usually, if the time zones you're looking at are in UTC, it shouldn't be a huge problem. But again, any locally recorded timestamps could start to add confusion to your report. We also want to know, are there any timestamps being missed by your tool of choice? Is there a modified timestamp that's not being used, or a red timestamp? Something that exists in the data that isn't being shown by the tool. And this goes back to what Paul said and Alexis about going into the data and validating and seeing what else is there. And finally, it's always worth double checking that the timestamps that you are being shown are correct, either by digging into the source data, calculating a few of them manually and making sure they're accurate, or verify it live on the device to make sure that the time the device is reporting is the time that your tool's reporting as well. And now I'm going to pass you over to Mike, who's going to speak a little bit more about digging into Hex.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so Hex, don't fear the Hex editor. I was super stoked to take this slide because I feel like it applies to almost every one of the 6 steps in some way. And so, you know, it should come as no surprise when you realize that digital forensics is predicated on this, right? Tools remove the need to do this manual work to get to that data in the first place. But that doesn't really mean that you shouldn't develop and maintain those skills, because the tools can and do get it wrong. On the slide here, we talk about training, which is always good, but not always available. So technical blog posts are also great. You know, find one that's similar to what it is you're trying to do and emulate it. Use the community and find a mentor who can act as a guardrail as you go through that process for yourself. You know, hex editing is sort of famous in forensics for finding the type of file via headers and magics, or when you're venturing into that scary realm of unparsed artifacts. But it's also super relevant for verifying data, particularly if that evidence is going to be core evidence to your case. Imagine a piece of evidence that, if you're interpreting it wrong, could mean the absolute opposite in the overall impressions of what took place. You know, I've heard examiners expressing certain hesitancy because they don't want to put it in the report because then it draws attention to it and they don't want to have to talk about it in court. I would argue that that potential always exists. So wouldn't you prefer to be in a situation where you're talking about something that you do on the daily, that you're well versed in, and that you're just eager to talk about it because you deal with it so much? Knowing the hallmarks of different forms of encoding and serialization opens the door to, we talk about multi-tool validation, and perhaps folks might think that means forensic suite A and forensic suite B. That's a great option. But if I can readily identify this particular data is protobuf, now I have 6 or 7 other options for tools that maybe aren't even forensic. They don't have forensics in their name, that I can use to help validate that process. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Paul.
If there's any questions when it comes to, it kind of comes back to, as Alexis was talking about, as we kind of going through these steps about, if there's questions about how and why is this tool doing this or that, reach out to support. There's no shame in this. Ask questions, be curious. These questions are important. There's never a stupid question. There are excellent people in support and all these vendors groups that are there to answer your questions. Different people have different levels of experience. Do not be afraid to ask questions. Again, it could also be that you help identifying something that, as Mike mentioned, that sometimes a tool gets it wrong. It's possible. There's never a stupid question. There's various support channels, whether it's email, by call or calling or chat, whatever fits your need. Do it. Don't be shy. Don't think, hey, they're going to think I'm a noob at this. Ask, because it's important, and it's very important that you understand, so you don't kind of put yourself in a position that make a bad statement or a bad conclusion based on something that you didn't understand. All the vendors have support groups that are there to help. There's lots of places to reach out, and don't be shy to do that.
Reaching out to the community is something that everyone needs to do, and you should do, but there also has to be a point where you kind of have to create your own test data. You understand your investigation like nobody else. If something does not make sense to you, this is where creating the data, it does not have to be super complex. This is something that I worked with Ian recently a lot on, and I leverage RTex, which is a tool that Ian created just to get quick information from something. A simple test such as what happens when you change a time on a phone. And this was a question that came into a listserv at one point, and the person makes a call. What's that time stamp going to look like? I did exactly that. I wiped a phone, did a call, used RTex, pulled that data, and had an answer within 5 minutes for the person. But then that also led to a blog that I wrote, because now I was curious about different log files and things. You don't always have to take it to that level. You could do a simple test that makes you 100% sure of what that data means. And like Mike was saying, does it always have to go into the hex? No, but if you understand and you're doing these types of tests day in and day out, it makes sense. Even more important, time zone stuff. So time zones are very, very confusing. And one of the forecast nominations, Matt Geckel and I worked honestly over 3 years on that paper that we put through DFIR review, because the timestamps were weird. There's a timestamp for Bluetooth on Apple devices that is always in Pacific Standard Time. It made no sense to us. So understanding that data, if we didn't recreate it, it would have never made sense to us. And it makes a difference in many investigations. And I cannot say this enough, but if you create test data and you can provide it like the amazing Josh Hickman, do that. I leverage Josh's images so frequently. You'll get CTF images from Magnet, from Celebrite, from the other groups. There's a lot of universities who provide test images. Use those for your testing. If Josh documented that something occurred, fantastic. But the issue is when it needs to make sense to you and what you think is occurring, you cannot be afraid to create test data. There are so many of us on Discord and other places that you'll find us that will create test data with you and be your fake friend. And it's a reality we live in. Don't fear it. Do not fear the test data. And I'm going to hand this now to Jessica.
Thanks, Heather. So in doing the creation of your test data, or in any of these steps that Paul or Alexis or Ian or Mike or Christophe have talked about previously as you're going through the analysis, it is imperative that you take notes. Those notes should be both contemporaneous and complete. And the reason that you want to take those notes as you go is so that A, you don't forget things or miss things, but when you're validating, a lot of times something I looked at or a process or a version that I've tested or I've validated, things change to another version, or I see the same application again. So note-taking will help me when I see that same problem again, but it'll also help me when I'm questioned. If I have those good, strong notes and I have to testify or I have to go back to that case a couple of years later, I like to say, you never know if you're going to get hit by the lotto. Somebody else may need to look at those notes and be able to take your evidence and replicate it. If you, for everything you validated, took very detailed notes, it'll be helpful. When you're testing, I like to write out my script ahead of time because it saves me time when I'm doing my note taking. And then I can have those notes be referenceable when somebody else maybe wants to use that data set to look at things that they're seeing in a different way. I love what Heather was just saying about, for example, the test sets from Joshua Hickman. Because of the level of his note-taking, years later, people have been able to go back to those images and recover new artifacts. That just happened over the last 2 days. Josh posted about a new artifact and said, yeah, it's actually in that data set I created last year. And the only reason that you can validate that new artifact is because those notes were there. But it also matters when you're validating your particular case, because you never know how far away it's going to come up. My last note on note-taking is that those timestamps are really critical in your notes for when you both take actions that you're doing investigatively, because things change, especially if it's cloud stored data. I can tell you in our presentation that I'm going to be doing tomorrow on the portal, so this was just stuff I was doing in the last couple of weeks, we did some notes that were very, very clear on the data and how we interpreted it. And then we did another cloud poll after testing something, and the entire results were completely different in what Facebook was storing. So we were able to look back at our old notes of what we had done, how we had done the poll, and what we had gotten back to verify that we weren't losing our minds and that indeed things had changed. So those notes are going to be absolutely critical in everything you do. And I'll turn that over to Mattia to talk about the retention of documentation.
Okay, thank you. So this point is really important as all the others. Maybe it's the less technical one, but it's something that you need to be aware of. First, always keep a copy of your report, unless you cannot keep it because of your local laws. But in any case, keep track of the process you followed. This is an important point, because you can be you need to go in front before the court, and maybe you don't remember what you did 2 or 3 years ago. So that's why documentation is a key point. Is a key point mainly for you. So that's my important point, is you have to know how, you have to remember something that you did maybe months before, and our mind is always full of new things to do, and so maybe you forgot it. Another important point and another suggestion I can give you is always write in your report which version of the specific tool or tools you used. And a suggestion again, keep a repository of the installers of all the version of the tools, because maybe there will be a counter verification of an analysis you did, and maybe you used a version of a tool of 1 or 2 years ago, and maybe at that time that tool was not able to parse some specific information, and maybe you can ask it, oh, you didn't do a great job. No, I did. I tried to do as best as possible compared to the knowledge that we had 2 years ago. As Jessica was saying, we all try to find new things, and we publish on Twitter, and from our post, maybe a researcher start a new research, and it takes time to correctly understand how an artifact generates data and to provide a proper interpretation of a specific data. And so and that's why sometimes we don't take risks if you are not sure of what we are writing. If you have an information but you are not 100% sure of what it means, you can say that there is an information, but you cannot say 100% what this information means. And maybe in 6 months or 1 year, a new version of a tool based on a research will be able to make the proper interpretation of that data. So in conclusion, I suggest you to keep the installer of the tools, because it's not always easy, and this is cross vendors, to find in your portal, in your where you can download the tools. They cannot keep all the version. I understand it's complicated. They are always kind and they support you in providing you the specific version if you need the installer, but it doesn't take a lot of space and keep an hard drive with all the various version of the tool. And last, I suggest you to have a very well organized bibliography. So you need to know where, if you want to say something and this something is based on a research, you need to have a well-organized bibliography so that you can refer to the specific point quite easily. I'm quite a maniac of organizing documents, so maybe I should have done something different than IT, so I had to work in a biblio. I really love organizing things, so I strongly suggest you to do it because it helps you when you have to write your report and have your documentation. And with that, I pass the words to John.
Okay, real quick, understanding the data comes back to understanding your audience, whether that's a prosecutor or an e-discovery client that needs to know exactly what they're looking at. Make sure you're taking a look at that final product before you pass it off. Not all data is going to be deleted by the user. This is really important when it comes to the file system and the efficiency of the file system and how it works. Understanding that there's some things that are not in the control of the user. It could be a user setting that's in the phone, set by default. And then this file recovery classification authentication. Jessica helped write that. I'm not going to steal her thunder, but it's a standardization of our tools and understanding that they have a baseline for the developers, how they're going to normalize how they look at the actual file set and produce the actual forensic results. So again, the easiest way to say this for understanding recovery data is if you can understand it, doesn't necessarily mean that everybody understands this. We got to stay away from our acronyms, our abbreviations, our COP terms. And I like to look at it like, does my 83-year-old mother, can she read this and have an understanding a little bit about what's going on, in the sense that it's played down quite a bit, and you want to paint a story. So that's all I have.
Thank you all. That was really, really cool to do, and I appreciate you doing this.